Okay, welcome, good people. Once again, Frankfurt Civil War Roundtable meeting. I appreciate you turning out, Matt. Charles Bogart, I'm the president by default of this organization. Our speaker tonight is Chris Hall. He's a native Kentuckian. He lived here in Frankfurt since 2005. He's got a BA from the University of Louisville, a master's from the University of Wyoming, and working on a doctorate at UK?
Washington State.
Boston, okay.
I love the program.
We were close. Anyway, doing his research, he found out he had a great-great-grandfather who was a sergeant in the 28th Kentucky. 28th Kentucky was part of the Army of the Cumberland. They were in the Atlanta campaign. When Sherman moves off to do his march to the sea, he sends the Army of the Cumberland back up in Tennessee because Hood is broken loose from Sherman, and instead of following Sherman towards the coast, he's moving north towards Cincinnati. So what's going to be standing between Hood and his march on Cincinnati is the Army of the Cumberland, of which the 28th Kentucky is part. So our speaker tonight, Chris, is going to tell you a little bit about his grandfather's involvement in a couple of those battles that took place between the Army of the Cumberland and Hood's Army of Tennessee.
Thank you all for coming tonight, and thanks for that kind introduction. Back in 2017, a team of archaeologists got in their vehicles and traveled to the historic town of Franklin, Tennessee, about 25 miles south of Nashville. As they got out of their vehicles and pulled up in front of this beautiful historic home, they unloaded, got their excavation equipment set up, and got to work. Their mission was to peel back the layers of time to expose the mid-19th century garden of this man, Mr. Fountain Branch Carter, and his family. By the end of their work, the archaeologists had unearthed quite a few artifacts that told us more about his life and his family's life and the history of Franklin itself. But they also uncovered evidence of a Civil War battle that raged across his property. I thought you all might enjoy, since it's a Civil War Roundtable, seeing some of the artifacts. Any idea what these are? In particular, that one. That is a .52 caliber cartridge casing that you can find on Civil War sites throughout the United States. But I assure you, this one's different. This particular one was ejected from a model 1860 Spencer repeating carbine exactly 160 years ago, Saturday. Since that day, it has laid silent in the ground, waiting to tell its story. And today we're going to listen to it. By the end of today's talk, this seemingly unremarkable artifact will come to stand as a testament to the bravery, the determination, and the courage of the outstanding and extraordinary men who fought on that fateful day, in one group in particular. So journey with me back in time as we witness the events that created those artifacts that the archaeologists found. I'm going to start in a different place in the story than I mentioned in the abstract. We're going to start tonight a half a mile south of the Carter House in what is today part of Franklin, full of strip malls, restaurants. But 160 years ago, the Columbia Pike still existed, traveling south over Winstead Hill down to Spring Hill, and if you continue on from there, south to the Duck River and Columbia. To the right of that field, or on both sides of the Columbia Pike, at this time were just fallow cotton fields. So as we begin our journey back in time, to around 3 o'clock in the afternoon on Wednesday, November 30th, 1864. And it's here, in this field, that we find our protagonist standing out on a warm, sunny day for late November. He hasn't slept nor anything of substance for more than 36 hours. He's battle-weary, and his blistered feet are killing him from the 30 miles he has marched since yesterday morning, much of which time he was fully engaged with the enemy. But resting's the last thing on his mind at the moment. For reasons still unfathomable to him, General Wagner has ordered his regiment to take a forward position nearly half a mile outside the main fortifications of Franklin, out in the middle of this fallow field. We ain't had time to think about that now. He has his orders. So he continues digging while other soldiers around him are busy scouring this bare landscape for anything they can find, ripping up fence posts, tearing boards off outbuildings, logs, anything to build a makeshift barrier to protect him out in this open field against the battle they know is coming. The rhythmic sound of his spade biting into the earth allows his mind to drift back to the day he enlisted. By the mid-spring of 1861, political tensions were high in his hometown of Louisville. Most of his neighbors, who were poor, working-class German immigrants who hadn't yet found the American dream, were all for the Union. But he heard both sides of the argument from when he were at work, where he was a molder at the local steel foundry. He heard the debates of whether General Goffin should fulfill Lincoln's request for states to provide federal troops to form an army. But William had already made up his mind. His parents were immigrants. They had instilled in him a sense of duty. And while others debated, William joined the Louisville Rifles in 1860. This small local home guard would later be mustered in as Company F, as part of Company F of the 28th Kentucky Volunteer Infantry Regiment in October of 1862. Early in the war, the 28th Kentucky was charged with guarding the many railroads that were throughout Kentucky and Tennessee and were the lifeblood for Louisville. William couldn't recall any particular battles that really stood out. They clearly engaged with the enemies, with the exception of one time in '62, they were captured by Morgan's raiders at Gallatin, Tennessee, an action for which court hearing found them not guilty of dereliction of duty, basically saying they were caught off guard. There was absolutely nothing they could do. But the memory still lingered. But the real excitement began when they joined Sherman's army for the Atlanta campaign. He remembered it. Dalton, Reseca, New Hope Church, Peachtree Creek. He had been there for all of them. And as he was sitting there digging,
"Hey, William?"
the sound of his tent mate's voice brought him back to reality. "What?" He turned to look at Jacob's Gaze further to the south, and in the distance, he saw the last of General John Bell Hood's Confederate army filing through the pass for Winstead Hill and gathering a mile in the distance. "That is one dramatically impressive sight," he said. "But there's only about an hour of daylight left. He'll go into camp and they'll attack the next morning." A half hour later, however, another soldier down the line hollered out, "Regimental flags are going up." Jacob grabbed William's arm. "Oh my God, William, they're going to attack today." The men out front grew almost into mutiny. One soldier later recalled, I love this quote, "Those gifted in profanity exceed all of their previous efforts." And soldiers up and down the line began pleading with their commanding officers, I can see the works from here. They're pointing to the north, towards Franklin. Another shouted out, "We're going to be mauled out here." But their commanders informed them that they had orders to hold this position at all costs. Well, the men pushed themselves to work at a frantic pace. One soldier later recalled, as soon as a man showed the least sign of fatigue, a comrade would grab the spade out of its hand and ply it with desperate energy. They continued working at this frantic pace until precisely 4 o'clock, when they heard in the distance the eerie sound of battle drums beginning to beat. Looking up from his work, William was struck with both amazement and utter fear. Less than a mile away stood a solid wall of Confederate troops in battle formation. Hood's men had started forward, their line stretching more than 2 miles east to west. They moved with precision, a well-oiled machine with deadly intent. The low angle of the sun, the setting sun, cast long shadows over the more than 100 regimental flags that were flying above that sea of gray. Well, the entire front line just burst into a beehive of activity. The noise of digging, hammering, shouting, orders, clanging of tools, it was just a chaotic symphony of noise. As the urgency reached a fevered pitch, William heard his regimental commander, "Company F, to arms!" William instinctively dropped his shovel, ran to the stack, grabbed his Spencer, returned to the line and quickly checked the tube, chambered around, knelt to a knee, flipped the sight up, set it to 500 yards. He slowly raised his weapon to his shoulder, pressed his cheek against the stock, gently wrapped his finger around the trigger, and took a long, slow breath. Sighting down his barrel, his face hardened as he realized that Hood's men had already passed his mark. A sudden rush of adrenaline flooded his system. His mouth instantly went dry. His pulse quickened. And then the honking sound of a faint rebel yell began to fill the air, sending chills down even the most veteran soldiers. Hood's men were now in a full charge, the earth itself trembling beneath their feet. Sighting down his barrel, 400, 350, 300. Hood's men went out 250 yards and closing quick. William's muscles tensed as he gripped his rifle, and then the order came. Fire! The battle that followed is considered by many historians to be the most brutal and bloodiest 5 hours of the entire Civil War. Those that witnessed it later simply couldn't find the words to describe what they saw, if they could talk about it at all. One soldier later recalled, "Franklin, Tennessee, those are words that will haunt my soul the rest of this life and the next." How in the world did the boys of the 28th get in this position? Why are the Federals so intent on holding this tiny town of Franklin instead of going to Nashville, where Thomas has thousands of troops garrisoned protecting that city? And for any of you who are Civil War buffs, you know that General Hood fights. That's why Johnson got replaced for the Atlanta campaign, trying to save Atlanta. Hood fights. But why is he attacking, with less than an hour of daylight left, a fully fortified position? And then finally, what's the result of the battle? And what implications does it have for the rest of the war? To answer these questions, we're going to need to pause the story right in the middle of the exciting bit. And we're going to rewind 2 months to September. Our destination is Atlanta. And it's here that we find the boys of the 28th camped along the Decatur Road east of Atlanta. which had fallen to General Sherman's troops 3 weeks before. Since then, his men, grizzled and weary, they were savoring a well-earned respite from 4 months of continuously marching, picket duty, and the brutal chaos of battle. However, the sight of the American flag flying over Atlanta sure brought a pride to their heart. These men knew they had dealt a significant blow to the Confederacy, and spirits were lifted, knowing that their efforts may have hastened the end of this terrible war. Although they still had their daily duties, some of them went into town to see wounded comrades. Others went on to the next mat. Sorry. Others were writing letters home, just tending to the mundane tasks of camp. The downtrodden moved, further to the southwest in Palmetto, there was a strikingly different move. Confederate John Bell Hood was encamped in Palmetto and was engulfed with defeat. He had been dealing with desertion, relentless battle losses. The morale was at rock bottom, and many of the soldiers questioned the cause for which they were fighting. But he had another concern at home. President Davis was coming all the way to Palmetto to get an explanation of Hood of what happened at Atlanta and why did we lose it and what are your plans next. When they sat down for their very tense discussion, they began with the obvious. The army is physically too strong and too large and too well supplied for them to try and pry him out of Atlanta. Rather, Hood makes this proposal. He will maneuver his entire army around Atlanta in a flanking maneuver and cut off Sherman's supply lines, forcing him to come out of Atlanta, where Hood hopes to draw him into some big grand battle. Davis agrees the plan may work, and so Hood puts the wheels into motion. As Davis goes back and begins talking about his grand plan to draw Sherman out of Atlanta, trying to raise the spirits of the Southern people. On the morning of September 29th, the first elements of Hood's army crossed the Chattahoochee River at Palmetto on pontoon bridges. A few days later, they reached their first objective at Big Shanty, Georgia. The men moved in swiftly at the break of day and launched a fierce attack. The unsuspecting Union garrison was overwhelmed and their defenses crumbled quickly. Seizing the moment, Hood goes on to tear up tracks further down the line. My animation stuff. Oh, here. Sorry. Keeps hitting tracks. He's at Allatoona on October 5th, Reseca on the 12th, and Dalton on the 13th, achieving various degrees of success depending on how big the garrison was there. And some of those towns he didn't take, he would bypass after trying to. Every time, despite these successes, don't forget, Sherman's sending men out of Atlanta to come after Hood. But every time he shows up, he finds this, and Hood's gone. He may as well have been a ghost out on that landscape. By mid-December, Hood's moved up towards Chattanooga, but is starting to drift off into the very hilly and rugged countries of northwest Georgia, where he's struggling to find a place to bring Sherman to that grand battle he was looking for. But his men are shoeless, blanketless, cold, wet, tired, and he's running low on ammunition. So the first thing he has to do is get resupplied. So he begins moving his army south and west to Gadsden. Sherman follows part of the way but stops. It is in Gadsden that Sherman meets with his brand new commander, General Beauregard, to discuss his options. As Hood's prone to do when plans aren't working, he starts thinking more grandly. And that's exactly what he laid out to Beauregard. His idea was that striking at Sherman's supply lines wasn't the dangling the carrot in front of his face that he thought it was going to be. So what he's proposing now is we will dangle all of Tennessee in front of him. So Hood's new plan is that he will go across the river, strike a couple of major rail lines, and then from there straight into Atlanta, or into Nashville, and then on to the Ohio. In October 22nd, Hood's army moves out of, that's him going to the Ohio. On October 22nd, Hood's army moves out of Gadsden as planned towards Gunther's, but when he gets there, he finds that it's heavily guarded with naval support on the river. So he diverts west to Decatur after a couple-day fight, decides after Union reinforcements arrive, decides it's untenable, and goes another 45 miles west to Tecumseh. After a small skirmish there, he's welcomed as a hero that evening in the town, and then after the evening celebration, he and one corps of Lee's division cross over the Tennessee River and establish headquarters in Florence, Alabama. 3 days later, a very frustrated Beauregard shows up in Hood's camp in the pouring rain, wanting to discuss his apparent inability to stick with any plans they agreed to. Hood explained to him, look, I tried to follow every time I'd hit someplace. There were federal groups there. It wasn't worth our effort to put it to. We were going to lose too many men and not gain the ground. So they begin discussing their plans, and what they determined is to say, look, we know that Thomas is sitting in Nashville, and he's trying to pull together these troops from all over the Western Theater to defend that and all of Tennessee. And that to monitor Hood, he has sent a small contingency down to Pulaski. His plan is that he will send Forrest's cavalry in front of his entire army, going up 3 columns, take Columbia, have the Federals in his rear, then there's nothing between him and Nashville. He will be on Thomas's doorstep in a 3-day march. Beauregard agrees that this plan really could work, and that time is of the essence, because every single day that passes, more troops are coming into Nashville, and Thomas is growing more and more strong. So Beauregard leaves with full intention that Hood's going to put that plan immediately into motion, because time is so much of the essence. But then the weather happens. It turns absolutely cold and miserable. Every personal diary you read for the entire last half of October and 1st of November talks about how absolutely miserable it was. It was not only making the men miserable, it was washing out bridges that were permanently, well, I guess not permanently if it's washing them out. Substantial bridges, it was making the engineers difficult so that they couldn't get pontoon bridges. Hood was stuck. He could not get his army, other than one corps, across that river. The roads were also knee-deep in mud. Wagons were getting bogged down. He wasn't getting supplies he needed. He couldn't move his men. They didn't have the rations to make the journey. So Hood's grand plan wasn't getting off to a great start, and time was ticking faster than Hood realized. There was a reason they hadn't seen Sherman. Just a couple days before Beauregard came into Florence to meet with Sherman, or meet with Hood, sorry, Sherman got a telegram from Grant. It simply read, "Proceed as you propose." Thus began Sherman's now famed march to the sea. Sherman was gone. But not before he left two corps with Thomas, the 23rd and the 4th. It was with that group that, remember I said he sent a small contingency to Pulaski. That's who's there, are those people. Including the 28th, by the way. 28th Kentucky is now in Wagner's division. In total, at Pulaski's about 2,500 men now. Schofield had been getting scouting reports. General Schofield was in charge of both those corps there in Pulaski, I apologize. He'd been getting reports, mixed reports, all evening about some saying Hood's cavalry are across the river, Hood's army is across the river. But then on morning of November 23rd, he received reliable intelligence that said the enemy is supposed to be near Columbia by one-day march closer than any of our columns. Hood had successfully flanked the Union position. When Schofield received word that Forrest was attacking a regiment in just south of Columbia, he ordered Wagner and Cox and Wagner's divisions immediately up the Columbian Pike. That included the 28th, and they quite literally arrived moments just in time to save Columbia from Forrest just walking right into it. So Hood just lost the race to Columbia. He's just been cut off. He spends the next couple days bringing up the rest of his army, sends 2 divisions forward to confront the Federals, and keeps the rest of his army out of sight. On the evening of the 27th, Schofield received word from Nashville that he was to hold Hood south of the Duck River at Columbia. And to guard against this, on the 27th, Schofield made 3 really important decisions. He left Columbia, crossed the river to the other side to the heights overlooking Columbia. He then moved to all of his supplies north of the town along the Columbia Pike to protect them against any of Hood's raiders coming across. He then sent out his cavalry to monitor any place along the river where Hood might cross. Schofield had now secured the high ground. He had his cavalry out, his eyes and ears were out watching the landscape, and all of his supplies were safe. And he'd been ordered to hold Columbia. He was set, no problem. But what Schofield didn't know was famed cavalry commander Nathan Bedford Forrest, known as Wizard of the Saddle, had been in his saddle all morning and had cleared out the Union cavalry. The Union cavalry is headed off this way thinking that he's heading to Franklin, so they're trying to get up to Franklin. He is not going to Franklin. Schofield just lost his eyes and ears, which means what? Hood's free to move around that landscape as he chooses. And at 7 a.m. he receives an alarming message from his cavalry commander. It's now 6 hours old. Remember, they got pushed off. Here's what it said. I think it's very clear the Army is aiming for Franklin, and you might get to Spring Hill by 10. Seeing this, Schofield quickly made preparations to move north. He ordered his enormous wagon train to start along the Columbia Pike up towards Spring Hill, guarded by Wagner's division, which includes the 28th Kentucky. Wagner's division was up at 5 a.m. that morning, on the road by 7. Within a few miles, they caught up with the wagon procession, which, by the way, is not just a couple wagons. It's 800 wagons and at least roughly 40 cannons. And then all the horses, mules, supplies to feed them. So it is miles and miles long. Meanwhile, in the small town of Spring Hill is lightly garrisoned. There's only about 200 federal troops there. It's just an outpost. So it was cause for great concern around 11 when they got word that Forrest was coming in from the east side of town. Well, the commander there at Spring Hill sent a dispatch to his commander to let him know that Forrest was attacking, and then immediately sent out skirmishers. Whoops, wrong skirmishers. Stand by. Immediately sent out skirmishers, but as I said, you've got one of the best cavalry commanders on either side of the army. They really didn't stand much of a chance. Meanwhile, further to the southwest, a courier speeds along the line of Wagner's men leading the supply train and just comes flying by. William screams out, "I wonder where he thinks he's going in such a hurry." And he and Jacob laughed about it as they marched along there. Then he saw him hand the note over to his immediate commander, Colonel Lane, and saw a troubled look come across Lane's face. Lane spurred his horse and began galloping down the line, screaming, "Hood is attacking to the east! Men, fall out of the double quick!" The boys peeled off and began running to Spring Hill. They arrived about 12:30, panting, wheezing, and on the verge of collapse. One of the brigades under Updike rushed to the north side of town to guard the wagons, some of which had arrived already. William and Jacob's brigade were rushed through town to the east side, where the 28th was immediately put out as skirmishers. They quickly became engaged with Forrest, but they couldn't hold off 4,000 horsemen until their sister division under Bradley would arrive on scene. But make no mistake about it, once again, the 28th and Wagner's brigade saved Spring Hill, just as they had done at Columbia. When the first of Hood's infantry began to arrive, they're coming up from the south, and he's hearing the gunfire in the distance, and he thinks it's just a small group of Federals still garrisoning that. And so he directs those men to go across the field to rolling landscape, parts that are forested, orders them to head due west, block Columbia Pike, right? So he's trying to block Schofield south of him so he can squish him with his army in the middle. As the infantry begins to move across that rolling field, a heavy and sustained fire comes out of a small forest area, rips into their right flank. The Confederate line convulses and begins to pivot. And as they do, that end brigade is yanked back as they swing forward and engage in a frontal assault on Bradley, Lane's sister brigade. The 28th Sister Brigade is now on site. He does a full frontal assault on Bradley, breaking the line as Bradley's men fall back to the safety of town. Lane's men swing over, which is the 28th Kentucky, and stop the infantry charge. As more Confederates begin arriving on the field around 4:30, they find the scene absolutely chaotic. Division commanders, corps commanders, nobody seems to know what's going on. They don't know where to put their men to be of best use. There's literally, it's 4:30, there's only 6 minutes of daylight left. It's going to get dark quick. So the men start settling down and going into camp. The 28th wasn't so lucky. They had to stand guard all night and hold that line that they had just reformed to ensure that Hood's men stayed put and didn't go anywhere. By 5 o'clock, there are 10,000 men on that battlefield, all in camp. Hood still has men coming up from the south. A large part of Schofield's army is still south down in Columbia. And what happens next? This is a War Roundtable. You tell me if you can think of anything else that is crazier than what happens next. And instead of telling you about it, I'm going to let you listen to it. There's several hours squished into one little soundbite here, but see if you can figure out what happens. The sun is down, you're in camp. What just happened? The entirety of Schofield's army just passed within, some cases, less than 100 yards from Hood's army. They just slipped through without anybody knowing. Some Federals saw the campfires, walked over to light their pipes, and were taken prisoner. That's why I let you listen to it instead of trying to explain it, because I have no explanation for why that happened. Well, Hood woke up the next morning on November 30th, 160 years ago this past Saturday, and is not a very happy camper. They're home called Villa. He calls his commanders in and blames everybody but himself for what happened there. Determined to salvage the situation, he orders his officers to immediately pursue Schofield's army with renewed vigor. He wasn't finished with this fight. Further north, William and the men of Wagner's brigade are crawling along as the Wagner procession is heading up north towards Frankfurt. The 28th is acting as flanking guards. Updike's brigade, which you'll hear more about, is one of their sister divisions, is taking up the rear guard. It doesn't take long for force to catch up with them. And they're in immediately just a full-blown running skirmish for 15 miles. Unknown to William at the time, he thought they were going to the safety of Franklin, but things were not going so well up in Franklin. When his commanding general, General Schofield, and General Cox arrived in town ahead of the wagons around 4:30 in the morning, they stopped at the first house they came to as they came into Columbia Pike. The Carter House, the house where the archaeology was done. They knock on the door, they wake up Mr. Fountain Branch Carter, commandeer his house as their headquarters. They opt to stay. And if you want to read some horrifying accounts of this battle, read some of his children's remembrances, not only what they heard that night, but what they saw the next morning. When they arrive at the house, Schofield puts Cox in charge, and he's off to find the shipping clerk. He had before arriving, he knew that the little bridge over the Harpeth River here at Franklin wasn't going to be enough to support the massive weight of his wagon train. So he had ordered pontoon boats sent down from Nashville. He finds the shipping clerk. Those got held up, they're not here. What about those reserve troops? I said, I'm going to need those when I get to Franklin. Oh, we sent them somewhere else. So he has a hornet's nest of Hood's army coming toward him. His back is against a river he cannot get across. He immediately begins preparing as best he can. Orders any of the troops that have made it into Franklin, which just continuously increases, to building works. There had been a battle here previously, and they're just refreshing all of these works, but it goes all the way around town. And just as the men were finishing up those works, much to William and Jacob's joy, they had just crested, they're coming up from Spring Hill, they've just crested Winstead Hill. Okay, it's the same pass that Hood's army was filing through at the beginning of the talk of our story. They've now made it up there. Hood's still behind them. And General Wagner says, hey, you guys fall out, get some breakfast. You haven't had anything to eat for several days. However, before they could prepare anything, Hood's cavalry made a full frontal assault in really strong force. Enough that another division that was up there basically got frightened off and pulls his men off Winstead Hill north towards Franklin. Wagner appears to have taken this as, oh, we're supposed to come off this hill. He orders his men to stop eating breakfast and making coffee down the hill. They get up to Privet Knob. A rider comes up, tells him to take the hill again. He takes his men back up the hill. Just as he gets up the hill, Updike, who had to stay up there to watch the cavalry and Forrest coming, is just spinning his men around and coming back saying they are coming full steam ahead. There's no way we can hold this hill. So they all start back. Conrad's brigade, there's 3 brigades in Wagner's division, Conrad, Lane, and Updike. Conrad arrives first, Updike goes in, if you're looking north to the right, to the east side of the pike. Updike comes next because he came off the Winstead Hill first. Wagner comes up to him, tells him he wants him to hook up on Conrad. Updike says, no way, Jose. They argue supposedly all the way down the pike towards Franklin. Updike saying, my men haven't slept or eaten for 36 hours and we have been in battle for 2 straight days. And he continues on and, well, sorry, I was looking for that quote. There's a famous quote, evidently, supposedly Wagner said, well, Updike, fight when and where you damn please. We all know you're gonna fight. And he spurred his horse and headed back to that front line where Conrad was. When he gets there, he tells Lane to go out in this field, which is where we found William at the beginning of this story. And we all know that at precisely 4 o'clock, Hood's 20,000 men came charging in on that front line that was a half a mile outside any protective works. Well, they slammed into the front of Conrad's brigade first. They're a little further up. The 28th, if you follow that arrow up, is where the 28th Kentucky is positioned. Those 20,000 men slam into the apex of that front line. And even though they fired at least 2 volleys, depends on whose account you read, all that massive line did crumble and they just move in closer. It didn't put any stop to them at all. Back in Franklin, General Cox, there at the Carter House, hurries to the front, where Wagner's men are going to be coming into Franklin, where the Columbia Pipe passes through those earthworks they've been fortifying. And what he saw on the south side of town was chaos. He said there's no semblance to order. Wagner's men, 2 full brigades, they were simply wild. It was simply a wild and uncontrollable group of 3,000 men running for their lives. The rebels are behind them, loading, firing, unleashing bullets into their backs. The men who went down cried out as much from pain as they did knowing that I just got left to the enemy. The guys that were in the works that day watched in horror as their fellow brethren were literally mauled. As they get closer and closer to the works, to the safety, the rebels begin screaming, "Go into the works with them." When I first read that, and I think a lot of historians talk about that like this, they're excited. They've realized there's an opportunity. You haven't heard me talking about the Federals firing at these charging men. They can't. Wagner's brigade is in between all the big guns, the tens of thousands of troops that are pointing their weapons in this direction. They can't fire because they'll hit their own men. Well, they held their fire as long as they could. The first volley was paced, but then it just instantly became alive and exploded into just hell fury. When soldier labor caught, they rose up and a flash of flame shot out in a sinuous line. The white smoke rose like the foam on the crest of a breaker, while the thunder of the volley shook the firmament. Any man remaining out front, regardless of what color uniform he wore, was in trouble. When they released that volley, there's one soldier who was in the works said, the few straggling blue coats and the long line of gray went down like ripe grain before a blast of wind and hail. Let's stop a second. I want to give you a sense of what you're witnessing here. When I found out my second grandfather was at that battle and where he was, I called down to the Battle of Franklin Trust, talked to their historian. I said, "Do you have any information on the 28th Kentucky?" And he said, "In Wagner's division, Lane's brigade?" I said, "Yeah." So my second grandfather served with him. He said, there's a long pause. He said, "Son," I forget how long he said he was doing it. He said, "I've been doing this a decade." He said, "I have never met a descendant from the men out front that day. They just didn't make it." Which brings us back to this little guy here. If you remember, this came from a 1860 Spencer repeating carbine. There's only one group that had that on the field that day, the 28th Kentucky. Where was that found? In the Carter House, inside the main works. Some of the boys made it back into the safety of the breastworks at Franklin. But that was ejected from a rifle. They turned to fight. As you can imagine, things in the front line where Wagner's men were coming in through the protected breastworks was just a chaotic mess. They tried to clear away for Wagner's men, but they were coming in too fast. And When the Federals slammed into those breastworks at Franklin, they ripped a hole in that line over 200 yards wide that they could just walk through. Well, Hood's men began pouring into the works, wave after wave after wave. Fighting broke out into really close quarter combat, men throwing punches, grappling over pieces of ground. One soldier later recalled, bayonets were used for unspeakable acts. Further north, on Little Swell, on the other side of the Carter House, remember General Updike, or Colonel Updike, who wouldn't fight? Well, he's back there camped, his boys are eating breakfast, and what he hears the chaos. Orders his men to arms, and as one soldier later recalled, Updike's men burst out of the ground like demons as they swept forward with their rifle and bayonets ready. Updike's men crashed into those charging Confederates that were coming north. He's coming south. One captain later said, description or imagination is hardly equal to the task of picturing the scene at any time. Men battled with fists, muskets, bayonets, shovels, axes, anything they could find. And just before sundown, there are 5,000 men fighting on Fountain Branch's Carter's property. There's one soldier who fired his rifle, then dismounted his horse, emptied his revolver, all chambers, turned the pistol around, grabbed it by the hot barrel, and violently swung the pistol at men's heads. When the barrel fell off, he dropped it, grabbed an abandoned rifle, and began bludgeoning men's brains out. Another soldier, this one. He's mounted, he's riding forward, the mount shot out from under him. As he's getting back to his feet, a mini ball rips through his shoulder, sending him back down to the ground. He drew his sword and began fighting again towards a Confederate flag he could see waving in the distance. A Confederate officer blocked his path, firing a pistol point blank into his chest. Before crumpling to the ground, he thrust his sword into the Confederate's side, but not before the Confederate got off yet another shot, hitting him in the leg. He was nearly trampled to death as the men of the Confederate were pouring in that line until somebody in the Wisconsin grabbed him and pulled him to the rear. That soldier, that guy's father, Arthur MacArthur. The field that day is full of stories like that, just ghastly fighting. And perversely, I think once the fighting stopped out of sheer exhaustion about 9 o'clock, it's been dark for 4 hours. Pitch dark. A new moon Battle of Spring Hill was fought on a new moon. So it's the day after a new moon. It is pitch black out when these guys are fighting in that front yard. The horrors they witnessed that next morning when they woke up are things that I would never put in a public talk, some of the things you hear described. There were horses out front, south side of those works, found the next morning shot dead, still standing, because there were so many bodies around. There were men found the next morning up against those breastworks, still alive, some of them not even wounded, with 5, 6, 7, 10 dead bodies on top of them. Who's familiar with Frank Cheatham? Very famous, war-hardened Confederate general. Here's what he said. Just at daybreak, I rode up on the field. Such a sight I had never seen. Can't expect to see it again. The dead were piled up like stacks of wheat. You could have walked over that field without stepping up on the ground. At the Carter House, bodies lay in a heap. And to the right, a locust thicket had been mowed by bullets as if by a sieve. It was a wonder that any man escaped alive. I never saw any field like it, and I pray I never see one again. But I think the memory that impacted me the most was when I was reading the Private Sam Watkins memoirs. I'm sure many of you have probably read that. And if you have read it, you know that he is very braggadocious when it comes to the glory of battle. But instead of reading it to you, let me just listen.
Kind reader, right here my pen, and courage and ability fail me. I shrink from butchery. Would to God that I could tear the page from these memoirs and from my own memory. It is the blackest page in the history of the War of the Lost Cause. I was there. I saw it. My flesh trembles and creeps and crawls when I think of it today. My heart almost ceases to beat at the horrid recollection. Would to God that I'd never witnessed such a scene.
Private Sam Watkins, Company H, Confederate Army of Tennessee.
Meet William Litch, the second great-grandfather. He and the rest of Schofield's army pulled out around midnight, 1 o'clock that evening, on to Nashville. Hood followed, but the Army of Tennessee was never the same. There were 10,000 casualties at Franklin, 6 Confederate generals killed. I forget how many field commanders. It literally broke the back of the Army of Tennessee. They would go on to limp into the Eastern Theater later in the war. Hood would, shortly after Franklin, resign his commission and retire to, I believe, New Orleans. William survived the war. Clearly, I'm here. Went back to Louisville and raised a beautiful family. But is one of those guys, evidently, that never talked about it. Because until I found out about it, we didn't know. But had Hood, let me just point out that to end, had Hood succeeded, the Civil War would have been a very different story after late 1864 and into 65. Had he taken Nashville and succeeded to go to Louisville, get on the Ohio, get over to Virginia, and become part of the Eastern Theater, the Army was devastating. So, thank you all for listening today. This has been my first foray into speaking and writing about history, so I hope it wasn't too dry. Hopefully it'll improve as I do more of these. I welcome any questions. I'm not a historian, but if I don't know, I'll tell you I don't know. I won't give you false information. Thank you all so much for coming.
Thank you. What you didn't mention is that cavalry unit out there that's fighting off force at Franklin is Kentucky units. I can't remember the general's name, but he's from over Paris, Kentucky. Lines up with Wilson's command during the Wilson's raid across Alabama and Georgia, except he's put on detached duty and does his own raid to Alabama. It's an interesting piece. The Franklin battlefield is lost in urban development, as you saw, but it's still there to be visited. It's well worth stopping and visiting.
Let me say this, over the past 10 or 15 years, if not a little longer, the Battle of Franklin Trust, look them up. They have done an amazing job. I'm a trained archaeologist. Historic preservation is my passion, and I can tell you the Battle of Franklin Trust is one of the best examples of battlefield preservation. They are about to buy up the last building. I forget, it's a multi-million-dollar contract to buy up a building, to tear it down. They will have a view from the Carter House to Winstead Hill, like it used to be. Richard?
Was it the Carter House on the front porch of which at least 4 of those Confederate generals were placed. I remember reading this.
Carnton House.
Was it the
Carnton.
Carnton?
Yeah, it was in the, so I talked specifically about where my relative was. There is an entire eastern flank that has more devastation. And there's a house called Carnton Plantation that became one of the big Confederate hospitals. Pretty much every house in Franklin after the battle was a hospital. I mean, there were people still there like 10 or 12 years later. I mean, it just became part of the town. But there were people in the house at Carter House, wounded soldiers, but most of the Confederates, I believe, were at Carnton.
What happened to the 28th Kentucky after the battle?
They went on to Nashville, and then eventually over to Texas, into the Western Theater, and they're mustered out in that following year, December, in '65, down in Texas, and come back to Louisville via boat.
Yeah, I can't think of the name of the Confederate general in Texas, but he doesn't surrender till like 2 months after Lee surrenders. As a matter of fact, he doesn't really surrender. He takes his troops that want to go with him, goes down to Mexico, and joins up with Maximilian in Mexico. So he's fighting for the emperor, who later was killed down there. But he's never surrendered along the way. And somewhere along the way, he gets a pardon, much like the president just pardoned his son, and he comes back to the country. He's all forgiven, although he never surrendered. Really weird on that whole deal. The Nashville campaign is also well worth visiting. Once again, most of us lost urban development in that. Rand is so fed up with Thomas that he sends a kid out there to relieve him. And about the day before he gets there, there's snow and ice all over the ground. And then Thomas launches the attack and wins the battle. And we wind up with a town in Kentucky called Fort Thomas, up in northern Kentucky. Named for him.
There are several very good books written about the Battle of Franklin. I had to be really picky of what I chose. There's a lot more to the story. It's pretty fascinating.
And I'll throw out one more thing. Thomas's wife does a terrible thing. Thomas dies about 5 years after the war in San Francisco, I believe. He's out, and he's got the Pacific Command. And his wife burns all his papers because she says he's written terrible comments about some of his fellow officers that doesn't need to go to press. And thus, Thomas has no real biography because there's really nothing available about it except Grant and that, who sort of disliked Thomas along the way. Don't burn your husband's papers.
And at Franklin, one of the generals that was killed was Cleveland, who was what they call him, the rising star of the West. I mean, he was loved by all his men, by all the commanders, and he was the one at Spring Hill that brought in the infantry and does that first charger I talked. They wheeled around, and we lost. We don't have his account because he didn't make it. So Spring Hill is still why those Federals made it through that camp. Yes?
So the Wagner, is he the same Wagner that was in charge of Murfreesboro in 62, the fall of 62?
Was George D. Wagner at Murfreesboro? Because
I don't know, that's a good point.
I'm not sure if it is or not. I really don't know. The 28th wasn't there as far as I know.
Yeah,
But they may not have been under Wagner at that time. But people jumped around all the time. So. But I don't know that for certain.
Okay.
Plowder's there with, later becomes commanding officer of the Lightning Brigade. He's there at the end. His men come in right before surrender, but it's another battle that's really weird that needs to be talked about someday.
Thank you all so much for coming. I really, really appreciate it.
We're putting